Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for joining this conference on the future of human rights. It is an annual conference organized by the European Parliamentary Research Service. So first of all, I would like to thank the service for organizing this, because I think it's very important to bring these topics as well to the European Parliament and people to the European Parliament to discuss a little bit in a more informal manner, something that is not happening in the plenary, something that is not happening in a committee, because the issues are as well for let's say trans committee as well in this European Parliament. So I think it is important to have a little bit a wider perspective, and I would like to thank our panelists of today. It is Mrs. Nadia Volkova, lawyer and founder and director of Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. She is in Kiev for the moment, so unfortunately she can't join us physically, but she will be connected remotely. And then we have Mr. Ayman Noor, the former presidential candidate and the chair of the Egyptian National Alliance. Welcome here to the European Parliament. We also have Adam Lupel, Vice President of the International Peace Institute, and last but not least, Shada Islam, the visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and I think we all know that the world order as we know it has been challenged or is being challenged, and we are living in a world where authoritarian states are opposing to the democratic world. We have more and more frictions, and since the end of February, we see Russia's invasion in Ukraine, Ukrainians defending our Western values of democracy and freedom. And we also see on other parts of the globe the Chinese repression of democratic movements in Hong Kong, for example, but also the very persistent violations of human rights in Xinjiang against the Uyghur people. And this proves as well that the EU-China dialogue on human rights is not delivering and not making movements into the right directions. And because of such abuses, the European Union has as well imposed sanctions on China. This have not been without a reaction. Many of the colleagues of mine here in the European Parliament are as well now on a blacklist by the Chinese. And we also know that, for example, the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China is on hold since then as well. So I think it is very, we are at a crucial point there where a dialogue doesn't seem to deliver. We also have, of course, the Russian behavior already since 2014 with the invasion of the Crimea, where the European Parliament has strongly condemned this move. We have as well made a huge pressure there, but nonetheless, we all know that since February, Russia is doing and having a strong war in Ukraine, and I think we have a lot of this kind of aggressions. We have a lot of geopolitical torsions that are happening for the moment, and I think it is important that we find as well solutions, that we identify these tensions going on and we try to address them, even though that we know that our leverages are limited. And when you are face to face with a dictator, of course, our sanctions are not always having the impact we would like to, because we all know that those regimes don't care so much about their citizens as we do in our democracies around here. So I think it is very important that we identify these tensions going on. There is as well new kinds of, let's say, of more hybrid tensions that are going on. We all know that, for example, under the pandemic of COVID-19, a lot of regimes abused or used this situation of even enlarging their powers over their citizens. This is really a very ugly game that is going on, and I think we have to address these issues together. But I am not the main speaker. We have many important speakers today, so I will not lose much time and launch our discussion with our invitees. And I would like to start with Nadia Volkova, who is connected remotely. As I said, she's the lawyer and founder and director of the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group called ULAG, and Mrs. Volkova, relying on both her international and domestic experience in the area of justice and accountability, focuses on engaging and designing accountability mechanisms for serious crimes in the Ukraine in order to build the capacity of the domestic legal system with the view to ensuring justice of highest quality for victims of war in Ukraine. And then secondly, Ayman Noor, he's the former presidential candidate and chairman of the Egyptian National Alliance and head of the liberal Gat al-Tawara party. I hope I pronounced it well. And Mr. Noor ran in the first Egyptian presidential elections against Mubarak in 2005, which led to his arrest and 5-year imprisonment. And following the 2013 coup d'etat, he left Egypt and founded Al-Sharq TV channel, which is considered the most prominent opposition channel against Sisi's regime. And he was elected head of the Egyptian National Alliance, which is an umbrella that includes all Egyptian political opposition forces around the world. And then thirdly, Adam Lupel, he's vice president of the International Peace Institute, and Adam Lupel is the vice president and chief executive officer at the International Peace Institute in New York since 2016, and he's also a writer and international relations expert, and his research is currently focused on matters concerning globalization, multilateralism, and prevention of mass atrocities. And then, last but not least, Shada Islam, visiting professor at College of Europe and independent commentator and analyst on European Union affairs on Africa, Asia, geopolitics. And Shada Islam works independently as an advisor, analyst, and strategist on issues related to Europe, Africa, Asia, geopolitics, trade, and inclusion. And she's currently editor of EU Observer magazine, as well as visiting professor at College of Europe in the European Interdisciplinary Studies Department. And Mrs. Islam is a member of the European Policy Center Strategic Council and senior advisor for its Europe in the World program. And now she runs her own Brussels-based global strategy and advisory media company, New Horizons Project. So, and my name is Christoph Hansen. I'm a member of parliament from Luxembourg, and I'm here since 2018. And I think I am very honored to be able to chair this meeting. And I would as well immediately start with the questions. The first one, maybe to Nadia Volkova, who is connected remotely, and according to the current situation in Ukraine with Russia, the propaganda trying to obliterate the truth completely has highlighted more than ever the need for real journalism that covers facts on the ground and sometimes at risk of the journalist's life. And clearly this has a very strong impact on democracy. Can you maybe give us some insights into your experience and what should the conditions be met and necessary for peace and justice in Ukraine? And I would hand over for this question to Nadia Volkova.
Hello. Hear me well? Just a small correction.
We can hear you, we can see you.
Great. Thank you. Just a small correction. I'm not currently in Kiev. I'm in Western Ukraine in the mountains, hiding from the war, obviously. And so my connection is not very stable, so apologies in advance, but I'll do my best to deliver my intervention to the best quality. So thank you for inviting me to this important event and for allowing me an opportunity to share my thoughts on the issue of the current threats to democracy and also what needs to be done in order to neutralize them. Naturally, I will be speaking about the current situation in Ukraine and the role of the EU in this context. Quite ironically, today is the day when the European Commission will be making and likely announcing its decision maybe not today, but soon, on the candidacy status of Ukraine in the EU. Therefore, I would like to start by putting forward a couple of observations. First, Ukraine's application would not have been considered had it not been for the full-scale invasion in February this year so soon, which means that ironically it is the war that started by Russia that has been the main catalyst for the change in Ukraine's application process for the EU membership. Secondly, a recent study of the public opinion of the EU member states, which was conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations, revealed that while Europeans feel great solidarity with Ukraine and support sanctions against Russia, they are split about their long-term goals. They divide between a peace camp, 35% of people that wants the war to end as soon as possible, with Ukraine agreeing to various concessions, and a justice camp. The more pressing goal is to punish Russia. I would like to reward the last phrase. I would say or suggest say not to punish Russia, but to make it accountable and responsible. Study shows that in all countries, peace camp is larger than justice camp. And although the authors are concluding that governments will need to find ways to bridge the emerging gaps in order to strengthen European Union unity and avoid polarization between and within the countries, I'm wondering whether it is the polarization between the countries that governments need to bridge. Would it not be more important to bridge the polarization between peace and justice? Is peace possible without justice? I know that yesterday my colleague Alison Smith spoke to you about war crimes and fight against impunity, and incidentally, she is from the organization called No Peace Without Justice, and I absolutely love that name for the organization because it is the essence. So how to reconcile these two observations? I think that the same way the full-scale war against Ukraine by Russia has been a catalyst for the Ukraine's EU membership process that shifted it from the standstill, war in Ukraine is also a catalytic effect on the architecture of the European Union. It has certainly led to taking a careful look at the European values such as peace, justice, solidarity, mutual support, care, reciprocity, but also independence and self-sufficiency and resilience, their hierarchy and their interconnection. But more importantly, this war has also revealed all the existing weaknesses in defense and security in the face of very real nuclear threats, hunger, irreparable damage to climate, poverty, threats to economic and financial systems, and many more. So this war has essentially so far served two purposes. One, it has magnified the existing problems in Ukraine so that they have become even more obvious and apparent, and they can no longer be ignored because it is really another chance to start dealing with them. Otherwise, next time is going to hurt even more. And second purpose, it has done the same for the EU, only in slightly different vein. It has revealed the issues that require urgent attention. Otherwise, the gap and fragmentation that's already been evident will lead to eventually disintegration. Both cases require effective solutions, and they can be sustained if they are built on the democratic values and the rule of law, but also on the qualities that I mentioned above and that this war demonstrated to us. People are still capable of mutual support, solidarity, resilience, care, and so on. As things stand now, it appears that EU and Ukraine can benefit from one another in more than one way. EU has something that Ukraine urgently needs in order to start looking for sustainable solutions. It has experience of building strong democratic institutions, high quality and independent justice systems, which have the trust of the people, as opposed to Ukraine, while, as this war has revealed, Ukrainian people know how to be resilient, they know how to support each other, they know how to fight for their freedom and defend their land, they know how to be solidary, and this is what Europe lacks according to the study. In essence, Ukraine and EU can help strengthen each other, and it is time to do so. But of course, for first, Ukraine, with the help and support of the EU and other countries, needs to end the war and achieve sustainable peace. And still, EU can and should play a major role because justice is the very key element that will help make peace sustainable. It will serve as a basis and glue for the rest of the processes, but most importantly, of course, sustaining peace. We are aware that EU had attempted to help out with justice processes in Ukraine to some extent since 2013. For example, making ratification of the Rome Statute and its implementation into domestic law requirement contained in the Ukraine-EU Association Agreement, which, by the way, still has not been done. The European Parliament adopted a number of resolutions on the need to combat impunity. Unfortunately, none of it was sufficient enough despite the best effort of the policymakers, diplomats, politicians, and even civil society. And when solid, good quality justice system is needed the most, Ukraine does not have it. All we have now is a number of poorly coordinated initiatives to document evidence of grave crimes and not a single 100% reliable accountability mechanism, apart perhaps from from only the ICC, but on whose effectiveness the judgment is still out. Ukrainian legal system needs a boost beyond current initiatives. It needs a hybrid accountability mechanism to prosecute grave crimes, which would allow consistent increase of its capacity. It would consist of international professionals and national experts with a separate mandate, which will gradually be integrated into Ukrainian legal system, with international element gradually reduced once the capacity of domestic authorities is built. EU has set up and been supporting such mechanism in the case of Kosovo, for instance. Other examples include Bosnian war crimes chambers, Sierra Leone, and so on. Therefore, Ukraine is an investment for the EU. Once Ukrainian legal system is strengthened and justice is achieved, peace is built, Ukraine can become a strong and worthy member of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Nadia Volkova. I would already have many questions, but I hold them for afterwards for the second round. And I would like to give the floor next to Adam Lupel. And maybe you could tell us a little bit how the major principles of multilateralism stand the test of the current conflict and involving a permanent member of a UNSC, which has breached most fundamental international norms. And how does the current standoff between Russia and NATO square with the claims that were made about the end of history and the triumph of peace and democracy after the dissolution of the USSR?
Thank you. First of all, I feel tremendously humble following Nadia on the front lines there. But I think maybe in response to your question, I think maybe my contribution can be to take a step back, look at the global system and how it's been impacted by the Russian aggression and the Security Council and all of that. So I'd like to focus my remarks a bit on what we call the crisis of multilateralism, which we broadly define in this context of rising geopolitical competition, decline in overall international cooperation, and a general perception that the international order is fragmenting, and that as a cause for some of the conflicts that we're seeing. And in many respects, the war in Ukraine is indeed a product of this broader crisis in the multilateral system. But of course, it's critically important to note, as we all know, that this crisis did not begin on February 24th. It is in fact a long-term result of the weakening of commitments to international law and the consistent violation of these fundamental norms on the use of force and human rights over at least more than a decade. And we've witnessed the increasing vulnerability of civilians in conflict contexts around the world as a result. At the International Peace Institute, where I work in New York, we've been following this debate around multilateralism for some time, and going back, I think, 5 years or so to the 2016-2019 context, where which was very prominent in conversations. Europe started the Alliance of Multilateralism in defense of the multilateral system. There was a lot of talk about this, about the crisis of multilateralism and the fragmenting of international order. And this often centered around fears of a rising tendency toward unilateralist nationalism and authoritarianism in the United States as elsewhere. But at the time, there seemed to be very little granular understanding of what exactly was happening, where the system was fragmenting, where it was strong, where it was weak, and really where it could be heading, looking ahead. So over the last 2 years, IPI, in partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace, have been developing a research project, a multilateralism index, to better measure the course of the multilateral system and its impact on peace and security. Looking at the period between 2010 and 2020, looking at indicators of participation, performance, and inclusivity across 5 domains, including human rights. And I think that some of the early findings are relevant to this conversation that we've been having over the past day and a half. Some of them, I think, come as no surprise, but some are somewhat revealing. As is perhaps no surprise, in that period, 2010 to 2020, we see a general decline in the performance on human rights indicators around the world, and this has been noted by numerous speakers in the last day and a half. Indeed, according to Freedom House, civil and political rights have been on decline for every year for the past 16 years. In that same period, the index tracks an overall decline in measures of international peace and security. The number of countries globally that are not affected by state-based conflict reached its low in 2020. So this is not just about Ukraine, this is a global issue. This sort of comparison between human rights and peace and security, as an old political scientist, I do know that causation or correlation does not equal causation. But there is a relationship, and we do know that. Violations of human rights, especially when they correspond to exclusive political systems with state-led targets of discrimination, are a clear risk factor for increased organizational violence against civilians. And we also find that backsliding on democratic norms increases the risk of civil war. But this is maybe, we've been talking a lot about this, maybe this is obvious, but I think the revealing side, thinking about the multilateral system in this research, is that the data is actually not all bad for the multilateral system. While performance in the system is down across numerous indicators, participation in key parts of the multilateral system is up over the same period, including participation in the human rights architecture itself. And measurements of inclusivity are also up across the board, including on measures of civil society inclusion, public-private partnerships, and gender equality, all very important. So what does this tell us, and how does it bear on the current context that we're discussing? I think while we often tend to frame the crisis of international cooperation as one of the decrease of overall cooperation and a risk that rising populism, authoritarianism will lead to broad system exit and system collapse, what we are actually seeing is not a threat of forces leaving the multilateral system. What we are rather seeing is a battle over the nature and purpose of the system itself. It's not about just decay of the order. The order is in transition, but it's unclear on transition to what. And the decisions being made today in Brussels and New York and around the world will be critically important for that future order. In part, this comes from a rebalancing of some of the pre-existing poles of the international order. We seldom kind of forget that the UN-based multilateral system has always been a hybrid system. It is both an aspirational system of norms and human rights and a pragmatic system of managed competition. In 2016, one might have been sort of forgiven for seeing this crisis of multilateralism as simply a challenge to the liberal international order centered on debates between commitments to universal human rights and national state sovereignty. This remains important, but what the invasion of Ukraine reveals is the challenge to that normative order goes even deeper. The principles of non-aggression, inviolability of state borders, and limitations on the use of force, both on when and how and against whom it can be used, is where these two sides of the multilateral system meet: the aspirational, the principled, the normative, and the pragmatic. Because without adherence to these basic norms, we lose the very conditions for the possibility of the international rule of law. You have neither human rights nor managed competition. You are left with only might makes right and a recipe for endless war and human suffering. And it is these norms that are fundamentally under threat by the precedent set by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the future of human rights, I think, is at the core of all of this. It's a hard time to be an optimist. I confess I am an optimist, but it's difficult at times. But if I can end on one hopeful note, I think this has inspired citizens and governments, civil society, actors of all kinds, to wake up to a problem that has been coming for a long time. The threats to peace and democracy did not start on February 24th. They didn't start on January 6th in the United States. And they are not only coming from Russia. I think we've been talking quite a bit in the last day and a half about the need to take care of our own houses. And they've been coming for more than a decade. We are living in a polarized age, but my hopeful conclusion is that while the worst remain full of passionate intensity, the conviction of the best is rising. There's been considerable action in the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council here in Brussels, and capitals around the world to reinforce norms around the international rule of law in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. The bravery of the Ukrainian people, and I wish I could say this to Nadia in person, have really inspired us all. So briefly, to conclude, what needs to be done? We need to continue that work, to consistently protect those bedrock principles, to convince those who are, I think, regrettably called fence-sitters, to convince those that are fence-sitting, the non-aligned, who we should respect to remain non-aligned. We need to convince them that this is not about picking one side or another in a new Cold War. This is about ensuring the very possibility of maintaining international peace, and that is in the interest of everyone. And we need to focus on problem solving. The world is more independent than ever. Geopolitical competition does not elide the need for international cooperation to address many of the fundamental issues of our times. We've talked about some of these already: climate change, poverty, arms control, the pandemic. The list is quite long of things we need to work on. We need each other, and we can't forget that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam Lupel. And next on our panel is Ayman Noor, and I would invite you to take your headphones because you are speaking in Arabic. So my questions to you, according to your experience, is the relation between human rights and democracy? How do you see that? How important are the human rights for the development of a democracy? And what are the main threats to the democratic hold of a country? Because it's not just by installing, it's as well by maintaining the democratic values up and running. How have you witnessed this in your experience?
شكرا سعادة النائب، وأنا الحقيقة سعيد جدا أن أتحدث اليوم عن علاقة حقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية ودور أوروبا الشعبية والبرلمان الأوروبي على وجه التحديد في دعم قضايا الديمقراطية في العالم، وليس في منطقتنا فقط، وفي مصر بلدي على وجه التحديد. ليس سرا أني شخصيا مدين بجزء من حريتي وبجزء من حياتي للبرلمان الأوروبي على وجه التحديد، لأن البرلمان الأوروبي هو الذي دافع عن حريتي وحياتي عندما اعتقلت مرتين عام 2005. المرة الأولى عندما أعلنت ترشحي للانتخابات الرئاسية الأولى في تاريخ مصر، تم اعتقالي من داخل قاعة البرلمان المصري، واستمر اعتقالي لعدة أشهر. في هذه المدة انتهى اعتقالي عندما قرر 40 نائب من البرلمان الأوروبي زيارتي في سجني، فقرر مبارك الإفراج عني كي يلتقوا بي في منزلي. الاعتقال الثاني كان بعد خوضي الانتخابات الرئاسية المصرية عام 2005، والانتخابات الأولى كما قلت، وحلولي ثانيا بعد التزوير وبعد مبارك في هذه الانتخابات. فكان عقابي هو اعتقال من 2005 إلى 2009. شاهدت في هذه السنوات الأربعة موقفا بطوليا من البرلمان الأوروبي، من لجنة حقوق الإنسان، من أسماء مهمة ما زالت محفورة في ذاكرتي مثل السيدة إيما بنينو، السيد إدوارد ماكميلان سكوت نائب رئيس البرلمان الأوروبي في هذا الوقت الذي زارني في سجني هو وأطفاله. الحقيقة أسماء كثيرة ما زالت محفورة في ذاكرتي في هذه المحنة الصعبة. وأعتقد بعد انتخابي رئيسا لاتحاد القوى الوطنية المصرية الذي يمثل كل القوى الوطنية المصرية، ما زلت أنتظر موقفا كبيرا من الاتحاد أو من أوروبا ومن البرلمان الأوروبي فيما يتصل بحقوق المعتقلين المصريين، وجزء منهم احنا نتحدث عن حوالي 60,000، جزء كبير منهم من النواب وجزء من السياسيين وجزء من البرلمانيين وغيره. يعني أنا أعرف أن أوروبا ليست هي كل العالم، لكن أعتقد كليبرالي مصري أن أوروبا هي الجزء الأهم في العالم للمعنيين بقضايا الحرية والديمقراطية. أعرف أن أوروبا الرسمية ربما يختلف موقفها عن أوروبا الشعبية والبرلمان، لكن دائما رهنا على أوروبا الشعبية أو أوروبا البرلمان، ونقدر حسابات المصالح التي تحكم أحيانا موقف أوروبا الرسمية. أتفهم أن خلال ال 72 ساعة الماضية هناك قرار خاص باستيراد الغاز عن طريق مصر، هناك منحة للمساعدة الغذائية بعد أزمة أوكرانيا تقدر بحوالي 100 مليون يورو، ونستحسن هذه المساعدات لبلدنا ولأبناء وطننا. لكننا كنا نتمنى من أوروبا البرلمان، أوروبا الشعبية، أن تربط على الأقل بالتمني مثل هذه المساعدات بتحسن أوضاع حقوق الإنسان أو الحريات أو التقدم السياسي في مصر. كنا نتمنى هذا، مش بالضرورة كشروط، ولكن على الأقل كتمني أن يكون هذا مرتبط بقضايا حقوق الإنسان والحرية. يسعدني أن أنا أقول لحضراتكم نبأ صار ونبأ غير صار. النبأ الصار هو أن مصر بعد 17 سنة لأول مرة بتسمع خبر أعلنه رئيس الدولة السيسي، بدء حوار وطني شامل لا يستثني أحد. بعد 17 سنة لم يحدث فيهم أي حوار وطني. هذا هو الخبر الصار. أما الخبر الذي يؤسفني وهو غير صار، أن هذا الحوار الوطني الذي بدا لنا في البداية يدعو للتفاؤل، للأسف الشديد لا يدعونا للتفاؤل، لأنه غير حقيقي وغير جاد. غير حقيقي لأنه أسند لجهات تابعة لأجهزة أمنية معروفة ومعروف اتجاهها، أسند لرئاسة رئيس هيئة الاستعلامات المصرية وهو يتبع نفس الأجهزة. المدهش أن هذا الحوار اللي أطلقه السيسي وقال أنه لا يستثني أحدا بدأ باستثناء جزء من المعارضة المصرية في الداخل، وكل المعارضة المصرية في الخارج استثنيت من هذا الحوار. فالحقيقة لا أعرف مع من سيتحاور. ومن هنا هناك خبر صار بالنسبة لي، أن الجماعة الوطنية المصرية بمختلف اتجاهاتها قررت أن تبدأ حوارا وطنيا موازيا يوم 24/7 القادم، حوارا بين المصريين حول العالم، واحنا 14 مليون مصري حول العالم. هذا الحوار الموازي هو حوار حقيقي. أنا يعني بدعو أوروبا بشكل عام أن تهتم بهذا الحوار لتعرف ماذا يريد الشعب المصري وماذا تريد شعوب المنطقة من أوروبا التي ما زالت تحمل تقديرا كبيرا وخاصا. من حيث التقدير اسمحوا لي أن أشيد بأربع أشياء وأطلب من البرلمان 4 أشياء. أنا عايز أشيد بالبيان المشترك من مجلس حقوق الإنسان التابع للأمم المتحدة اللي صدر في مارس 2021، واللي أدان الاستخدام غير الصحيح للتشريعات الخاصة بالإرهاب، وهو استخدام يعني في غاية السوء في الحالة المصرية. أشيد أيضا بالرسالة المشتركة إلى مجلس حقوق الإنسان في فبراير 22، واللي تم المطالبة فيها بإنشاء آلية واضحة لمراقبة حقوق الإنسان في مصر. أشيد بقرار البرلمان الأوروبي في 18 ديسمبر 2020 اللي أكد فيه أن سياسة مكافحة الإرهاب والهجرة غير المشروعة يجب ألا تتعارض مع الحد الأدنى من حقوق الإنسان والحريات. أشيد أخيرا ورابعا بقرار البرلمان الأوروبي في أكتوبر 2019 بإدانة القمع ضد المتظاهرين السلميين في مصر بعد اعتقالات كبيرة في سبتمبر 2019. الحقيقة هذه الإشادات يعقبها بعض المطالبات، وهم برضو 4 مطالبات. أنا بطلب من أوروبا، من البرلمان الأوروبي على وجه التحديد، وأنا بستوحي هذا الطلب من كلمة السيدة نادية التي شرفت بالاستماع إليها وهي تناضل من على خط النار في أوكرانيا. لا تثقوا في المستبدين، لا تثقوا في الطغاة. الذي يحدث الآن في أوكرانيا هو ثمن للثقة في أنظمة مستبدة. لا تثقوا فيهم لأن سرديتهم تقوم أساسا على مصالحهم الشخصية وزعامتهم وبطولاتهم. ثقوا أن الحكومات المنتخبة هي التي ستدافع عن الغرب، وهي التي تحترم الغرب بصدق. ثقوا في أن هذه الحكومات المنتخبة ديمقراطيا هي التي تستطيع أن تواجه الإرهاب، وهي التي تستطيع أن تواجه الهجرة غير المشروعة، لأن الإرهاب والهجرة غير المشروعة هم سلاح المستبدين لإخافة الغرب وإخافة أوروبا. هذا هو مطلبي الأول، ألا تثقوا في هؤلاء. مطلبي الثاني من أوروبا هو البدء في حوار وتواصل مباشر مع المعارضة المصرية في الخارج، بالتوازي مع حوار مفتوح مع المنظمات الأهلية والمجتمع المدني المصري. من فضلكم، نحن في حاجة لهذا التواصل كي تعرفوا عنا وتعرفوا منا حقيقة ما يحدث في بلادنا. أنا بصفتي رئيس اتحاد القوى الوطنية المصرية المنتخب، أنا بدعو البرلمان لبداية هذا الحوار. آخر مطلبين، لأن أنا عارف أن الوقت قد يكون تجاوز المدة المسموحة. يعني بطلب الحقيقة وبشكل واضح متابعة الحوار الشعبي الذي سنبدأ به يوم 24/7 باعتباره حوار بديل عن الحوار المغشوش المزيف الذي يتم في مصر. آخر مطلب الحقيقة، نتمنى من أوروبا الرسمية والشعبية مزيد من الإرادة السياسية لتحقيق إصلاحات ديمقراطية وإفراج عن المعتقلين في مصر والدفاع عن حياتهم. بالمناسبة، أنا لا أنتمي لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين ولم أنتمي لها، وأنا أنتمي للتيار الليبرالي المصري، لكن لا أستطيع أن يفوتني أن النهاردة 17 هو نفس اليوم الذي مات فيه شخص كان زميلي في البرلمان، كان نائب معي، مات في قفص زجاجي وهو يحاكم محاكمة ظالمة، وهو أول رئيس انتخب في مصر ديمقراطيا الذي مات في مثل هذا اليوم 17/6 هو محمد مرسي. وهذه ذكرى وفاته، رغم أني لا أنتمي للإخوان لكني لا أستطيع أن أتجاهل هذه الذكرى، لأن هناك عشرات الآلاف من المصريين يتعرضون للموت في السجون المصرية. أنا بشكر حضراتكم، بشكر سعادة النائب شكر جزيل على تقديمه الطيب، وآسف إذا كنت تجاوزت مدة الكلمة المطلوبة، وشكرا.
Thank you very much, Ayman Noor, and you don't have to apologize. Your testimonies were very, very important, and I think everybody agrees that it was important that you stated them, and I have as well duly taken note of your 4 requests, and I will as well try to help to include those into our future resolutions. It's sometimes because sometimes for us it's a little bit frustrating as a European Parliament. We have resolutions, but not always it serves on the ground. But in your case, I think in 2005, the colleagues that visited you, this really made a difference. And that's why even we can't win every single battle, it is nonetheless very important to maintain raising awareness, showing solidarity, because if we don't do that, nobody will be aware of it and nobody will move on it. So I think it's very important that the colleagues in the past did this, and that we continue to put pressure on those that are trampling with the feet the human rights all over the world. This is something very, very important. Thank you very much for your testimony. And then I would like to pass the floor to Shada Islam. And of course, threats to peace emerge not only from interstate relations, but also from violations of fundamental human rights inside societies. And these stem very often from an authoritarian regime, but democracies have also proven vulnerable to this type of threats. So how can we defend peace and security worldwide against such threats?
Thank you very much, Christoph, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. And I have to say it's really humbling to speak after Nadia, Noor, and the eloquent message on the crisis of multilateralism provided by Adam. The short answer to your question, Christoph, would be the way we can actually work to prevent inequalities and discrimination against minorities is to implement our own treaties, our own conventions, and to practice what we preach. Europe's standing in the world, which is good, as Noor has explained to us, would grow and be more constructive, more positive, and more outstanding if we actually did practice at home what we preach abroad. We would be more resilient and we would get more action on the ground, which you yourself said sometimes our resolutions do not get to. So it's really quite interesting because we look at the question of inequalities, discrimination, violence, and human rights abuses at the moment, and we look at, of course, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which is, of course, a massive violation of human rights. And I'm not doing false equivalence here. I'm not talking about whataboutism, but I would like you to look also, Adam referred to it, the January 6th assault on Capitol Hill. What have we seen just now? We've seen Britain threatening to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. I never thought I'd see that day. It's appalling. And what really concerns me is that once one major parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy, sets out on that route, there is a danger that others will follow because repression, suppression of minorities, inequalities is a problem in our societies as well, in liberal and illiberal democracies. We've also seen, of course, Israel not responding to the demands for an investigation into the tragic death of Shireen Abu Akleh, still not there, and we see that the occupation Palestinians is a constant threat to security and peace and stability across the world. And Israel is a democracy. We talk about China and, outrageous discrimination against Muslims in Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. What we don't talk about is what India, a democracy in our midst, part of our alliance of democracies, is doing to its Muslim minorities, 210 million Muslims in India. This is not to say that Muslim countries aren't also repressing their minorities. That's happening across. India is doing it to Christians and Muslims. Pakistan does it to Hindus and Christians. In Saudi Arabia, let me not go into any details about what is happening in terms of repression. So this is something that is not between us and them. I'd really like you to think about that. This is not something that good countries don't do. This is something that all of us do. And this goes against the entire fabric of the United Nations the framework that has been set, which talks about the equality and the fact that there should be no discriminations against ethnic, racial, religious, linguistic minorities. They have all the rights that all of us have in our societies. But countries don't really keep to that. And we often engage, Christoph, in what I would call selective outrage. We're outraged by certain violations and breaches of human rights and of ethnic minorities. Geopolitically, we play that game, but we do not condemn when it happens in other countries. So there is an informal and unfortunate hierarchy of rights across the world. And that, I think, needs to be looked at. I'm a proud European. I'm very proud of the democracies in Europe, but I also think it's important that we acknowledge our own failings in many ways, especially when it comes to our minorities. So this is not about creating an alliance of democracies, it's about doing our homework. And I think President Joe Biden has acknowledged that. And I wish that more democratic leaders would actually acknowledge that we have to reinforce our democracies from within. Now, the EU treaty, and I work a lot on ethnic inequalities within the EU treaties put a high importance on the values for respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Now, my research, and I work on this almost as much as I do on geopolitics, is that the reality, of course, is very different. Ethnic minorities, racial minorities, linguistic, religious minorities across Europe face discrimination, intersectional discrimination. And we have seen, I mean, I'm not going to go into the details and I'm not going to name names, but just basically a country that I adore, the Netherlands, that is partly my home as well, has just acknowledged, the minister has acknowledged that there was systemic racism when it came to this social benefits. These are the kinds of things that are happening, and I am really proud that countries like Netherlands, like Germany, Belgium to some extent, are acknowledging these failings. And since Black Lives Matter movements in Europe 2 years ago, this is not an import from the United States. We have a Black Lives Matter movement here. We have demands for ethnic equality, racial equality here in Europe. And I'm really happy that some of our democracies, after hesitation, and some confused responses are actually responding to that. So what can we do? I think let's be prepared for more trouble ahead. We have a financial crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have a food crisis. And we know that we've seen during the pandemic that crises exacerbate inequalities. So we're going to see more inequalities come up as countries have to tighten their belts. And who suffers most when that happens? It is the social services. It is the education, health, etc. So we should be prepared for demands that we cut our budgets, and we should not allow that to happen because it's important that we do respond to that. What do we see when inequalities rise, when there are crises? We see populism, we see nationalism, and that is also going to, we see racism. It's their fault. Let's stop them from coming. Let's use Frontex even more to push back, illegally push back against those who are coming, who are fleeing wars and famine and climate change as well. We see inequalities also on climate change. So I think that if we are forewarned, we should be forearmed. And we've already seen, ladies and gentlemen, social unrest and political unrest caused by rising food prices, rising cost of living across Africa and Asia. My own country of birth, Pakistan, has seen a change in government, partly because of the rise of the cost of living. We've seen it in Sri Lanka, and Noor, perhaps we'll see it in Egypt as well. So this is going to be a major threat to peace and democracy. So it's urgent that we do something about it. One thing that I will also insist on is data collection. Now, this is something that I found in my research, is that we have very little data about, first of all, the number of racial minorities or ethnic religious minorities across Europe. There's a historical reason for it, which I appreciate and understand. But the reality is that if we do not have figures, if we do not know what is really happening on the ground, we don't see it and we cannot tackle it. So if we really need to work against racial discrimination, police violence, difficulties in accessing education, work, lodging because of your color of your skin or your religion, then we need to know how many people are suffering, because what is not seen is not tackled. And my final point would be, because I think I've done my 10 minutes, is that when we have these wonderful rankings from huge institutions, the Democracy Index, Freedom House, etc., because there is no data about what happens with racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, those factors, that data is not taken into account when we say such and such country is number one in terms of democracy and freedom. And I'm sure that if we did take that data into account, if we did see how racial inequalities or discrimination or police violence is I wouldn't say rampant, but exists in many of our democracies, those democracy rankings would be reduced. So my last plea would be really, this is not about criticizing democracy. I'm a fervent believer in democracy, but as I said, and as I've written for Brussels International Center as well, and I see my colleague here, in a piece, our standing, our reputation, our ability to bring change in what we despise that's happening elsewhere depends and hinges on what we do at home. And that means tackling racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, ethnic discrimination within our societies. And this is not just about Hungary and Poland. Unfortunately, the far-right narrative has been embraced by too many mainstream politicians. And I think without doing that, we will not be able to stand tall and become what we really want to be, a geopolitical Europe. And finally, like Adam, I'd like to end on a note of hope, because I do think, as I said earlier, in democracies there is accountability. People like me are allowed to say these things. We can talk in the European Parliament and speak truth to power. And I think with constant vigilance and our demands for justice, equality, and equity at home, we are going to get there. And I hope that other countries can also achieve that kind of liberty and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shada. And I will not go into the detail of your last remark on the geopolitical weight of the European Union. I think there is still some margin for improvement, because I think we have to speak better with one single voice. That is sometimes our weaknesses as well. I think when we are talking about Ukraine, when every single leader of the European Union is going to Kiev, is having phone calls with Putin and with Zelensky, I think I am sometimes a little bit worried, because I believe that it's of course good for awareness raising, but sometimes as well it's for the private media campaign, so it's not always productive if we don't speak with one single voice and we don't know what in these phone calls has been discussed. So this is of course quite worrying, I have to say. I have many questions, but I of course prefer that the public starts with the questions, if there is any immediately. I don't see, there are two already in the middle, so I can keep my questions for later. The first ones were, hands were raised in the fourth row, yes. Next to the lady in red.
Ionel Zamfir, policy analyst in the PRS. From the debate, I think it has become clear that, multilateralism, the weakness of multilateralism, the weakness of norms, whether it's about non-aggression or human rights, it's at the root of the problems that we have. And I like very much the idea that what we are seeing is a battle over multilateral institutions. Now, the Parliament has for many years supported the idea of a profound reform of the United Nations, particularly of the UN Security Council. So my question is, what are the perspectives of seeing such a big change, particularly when you think that in the United Nations now more than half of the countries are not democracies? So is this war in Ukraine, because now people have started talking about such a reform. Before it was more for specialists, but now it's become really part of the common public discourse. So is there a real chance for democracies to win this battle over multilateral institutions?
And I think this question goes to Adam Lupel, but I think we take the second one just next to the speaker.
Yes, thank you very much to all the speakers. It's really sad and interesting at the same time. I'm Elena Lazaro. I work with Ionel here at the European Parliament, the Research Service. I want to link two of the speakers' comments together, Ayman Noor and Adam Lupel. It was said that we should not work with or trust authoritarian regimes, and I think we all absolutely understand that. However, looking to the future of multilateralism, in those multilateral structures, we have a space for some kind of engagement with those powers, and it's always a very difficult question whether or how to continue to use these spaces of engagement, but definitely many have warned against disrupting that in the sense of dividing the world into competing systems, because that has its own inherent problems and threats. So I guess my question is, what can we do? And of course China, Russia are the two obvious countries in that sense, because they are also permanent members of the Security Council. So what are the sort of carrots, if you want, that can be offered to make more constructive engagement with these authoritarian countries in those spaces? And what should be our red lines for engagement at the point where we say, okay, now we do what you have suggested, Ayman Noor, that is, don't engage because they're not trustworthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And I think you highlighted as well a certain kind of our interdependence with certain regimes. The European Union, for example, is very dependent on Russian gas as well. We are now providing it from Israel and from via Egypt. And you mentioned this partnership, and not everything is ideal there as well. So I think sometimes, well, of course, here we had as well to react fast as a European Union to get an alternative supply for that gas. But there, of course, are other problems that are as well linked there again, but maybe we could comment that as well. But we have a third question here in the first row. And then I will give the floor to our panelists.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zaid Zaid. I'm Belgium, origin from Kashmir. So I have a question for all the honorable panelists. So before I would like to thanks to give an opportunity, and I would like to appreciate the organizations to organize such a wonderful event to discuss the human rights situation in all over the world. So as you know, our country, I have present yesterday as well. So we have, our honorable panelists have spoken the problems all over the world, like Ukraine, Afghanistan, in Colombia, and etc., etc. So Palestine, and nobody speaks about Kashmir and what's going on today in all parts of forcibly divided and occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir since 1947. So the person, Mr. Yasin Malik, what I would like to ask a question for you, who has been struggling since 1994 peacefully for the solution of peaceful solution of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and he has been arrested. He was arrested in 2019 illegally from his house in Srinagar, and after he is in solitary confinement. And Yasin Malik has been sentenced and convicted with life imprisonment on 19th May, last 19th May, under India's Security Law, Public Safety Act and Unlawful Activities Prevented Act on the 19th May 2022. He has been kept in solidarity confinement at India's notorious Tihar jail in Delhi since May 2019. So, Yasin Malik has been convicted under the Unlawful Activities Prevented Act, which is a colonial law that does not exist anymore, even in the Indian Constitution. So, charges leveled against him are not only illegal, but also false, politically motivated, and intended to silence him physically. So, my question is here to that: what the United Nations, UNHCR, and European Union are doing to take notice of the situation and call out India on the unilateral show trial on false and politically motivated conviction against the prominent Kashmiri leader Yasin Malik and other prisoners of conscience and journalists as well. So my question is for all the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think this is a perfect example to what Shada said about the selective outrage that we are sometimes having in the European Union. And I believe personally, because it comes sometimes maybe from the proximity, the geographical proximity, but as well from the people that we know. Of course, I have, for example, Ukrainian friends. Meanwhile, I have as well a Ukrainian trainee in my office, so I get daily notice of the crimes going on, and that is not the same for everybody. So I think that's maybe one of the roots, but I think this is something where Shada could elaborate a little bit further about the roots of this selective outrage. But we have a fourth question in the second row here. And then I'll give you the floor for the answers.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Fresh Fenish. I'm from No Peace Without Justice, working on Libya, Yemen, Syria, Palestine, and Sudan. My question is very straight. Given the situation now and what you described, all of you, don't you think that it's time for the UN system to be reformed, in particular the Security Council? And with the Ukrainian crisis today, when the European countries will wake up and decide to dissociate themselves from the US policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I of course believe personally that we should try at least to sit in the same boat, even though that not everybody is wants to go in the exactly same direction. We have similar problems as well when we are talking about the World Trade Organization. We also have problems in the World Health Organization. China doesn't want Taiwan to participate there, but nonetheless, I think there as well, where sometimes it's good to be to have strong allies. And I think on the question of Taiwan, maybe the United States is a strong ally that we have as well to use there at its best. But we have many questions. There was none directly to Nadia, but maybe I have a short question to Nadia. Nadia, you have as well talked about the magnificent effects of the war going on certain problems in the legal service, in the legal system that you have back home. Could you be a little bit elaborate what exactly you mean by that? That would be interesting for me to know. But I will maybe first start with a question that has been addressed directly to Shada on the selective outrage.
Thank you very much, Christophe, and thank you for the questions. If you allow, I would just like to come back to a couple of other questions because I do work on geopolitics, and I'll come back to the selective outrage. I think, you know, what we're going to see and is not a one world, two systems. We've seen this over the reaction of the world to the Ukraine crisis. I don't like the word non-aligned. It harks back to another era. I don't like the fact that people say people are sitting on the fence. They're looking after their interests. It's a multipolar world. And I think we need to understand that countries are reacting on the basis of also what I've talked about, double standards sometimes, because we say there is war in Europe, but there's war everywhere else too, many, many parts of the world. And selective outrage, we don't pay attention to those wars. And we send back, we push back illegally people fleeing those wars. So in my conversations with all of these countries sitting on the fence, if you like, it's clear that they are appalled at the violation of borders. They are not willing to fight a war which is between democracies and autocracies. They do not want that. Because as I mentioned, some of the democracies we have are not really fulfilling their values and standards as well. I think the way forward is not going to be international. I think it's going to be regional. It's also going to be theme-based, cluster-based. That's how countries are going to move forward in terms of dealing with climate change, poverty, sustainable development, pandemics, etc. I think a lot of the countries are working within smaller groups rather than within the United Nations system, which I think is really creaking and on the verge of falling down, really. On the selective outrage, I mean, this is something that, as Christopher said, it's normal in terms of proximity. You're in the neighborhood, your friends, they look like you, and neighbors have a solidarity obligation. This is what Pakistan is doing vis-a-vis Afghanistan. This is what Iran is doing vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Jordan is doing vis-a-vis Syrians. You know, there is the proximity issue. Where it becomes selective is when you really use racism and illegal, you violate treaties to send back those who do not look like you, speak like you, have the same religion, etc., etc. And that has to be called out. Racism is not allowed. Discrimination on the basis of race is not allowed. To your question, it's geopolitics, right? So at the moment, I'm not denying what China is doing to its Uyghur community is appalling, outrageous, and should be condemned. But other countries get away with it because geopolitically, they're on the right side. They're good people. They're democracies. So we do not use the same tools, the same values to condemn countries that are in open violation of our treaties, but they're considered to be democracies. We're allowing Poland and Hungary to be in major violation of many of our treaties, our European treaties. We're doing something, but it's a slow process. What I will just end with is, now that we're seeing that some of the illusion is fading from countries, that we see them, as Adam said, sitting on the fence, we're beginning to see that some countries are being brought to task on questions of ethnic discrimination and racial discrimination. So for the first time ever, I'm beginning to read in European papers the fact that Muslims in India or Christians in India are being discriminated against, sometimes very violently. So it really is our choice. We have geopoliticized human rights, and that's why I think, Christophe, some of our resolutions and etc. are not taken too seriously, because we know it's on the basis of geopolitical choices rather than real violations taking place in countries. Thank you.
Yes, I think you have a fair point there, because when such resolutions are drafted, of course, there are many political groups tearing on one end of the story and the others on the other, and often the message gets too much diluted and is not focusing on what is really at stake. But you have a very serious point where you addressed it. Adam, I think there have been many questions on the need for multilateral solutions, on the multilateral fora, reforms needed. What is your point? What can be achieved, and what should be our objective there?
Yeah, I mean, these are huge questions and very difficult ones. But just to start with the Security Council, I think, and also the question of reform. The Security Council has been experiencing a crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness for quite some time, and I think the performance, and it has been a performance, the performance of Russia at the Security Council in recent months has really just put a real point on many of the pathologies there. But there is a lot of work that continues to advance there on some of the issues lower on the geopolitical agenda. But the point about legitimacy and effectiveness is extremely important, because the world is watching. And we all know that the permanent members of the Security Council, the veto-wielding members, the Security Council do not represent the world any longer, if they ever did. Some of the work that we've been doing has sort of put some measure on this. When the UN was founded, if you measured the power of the P5 in material terms, in terms of economy, military, populations and such, they did collectively were more than the world, higher than the world on the graph. But somewhere around 1980, the rest of the world passed the collective power of the P5. Of the permanent members of the Security Council, and that causes that creates a real problem of legitimacy for the Security Council when you have members that can have so much power over the maintenance of international peace and security, which they are mandated to do under the UN Charter, and that means that there are increasing calls for reform, which are themselves very merited. But because of the structure of the Council and because of the veto, it is very difficult to imagine, no matter how many times we call it, for real membership reform on the Council. But there are efforts underway to minimize the use of the veto, and also to increase the political cost of using the veto. Most recently, the initiative by Liechtenstein to require a debate in the General Assembly after the use of the veto, and that happened for the first time last week or 2 weeks ago after the veto on a resolution related to North Korea. But I think more seriously, more fundamental to the system, I think that the Ukraine and President Zelensky's testimony, statement before the Security Council really has been a seismic event in the UN system, and it is causing a lot of questions about how the UN system can continue to place itself at the center of the maintenance of international peace and security, given the current context. Because it is, as I say, a struggle. I think I agree with almost everything that Chada says, but I think this point about that the UN is creaking and it's going to disappear, it would be a mistake to sort of make decisions based upon that, because the UN system is the architecture and it is being used by the authoritarian powers to advance their interests, because it is ultimately a system that was developed for member states to advance their interests, and you see this most vividly in the case of China. China is not stepping away from the UN, it's stepping forward and fighting these battles at every level, at the Security Council and down at the Fifth Committee, around budgeting around positions for human rights positions that have been mandated. The budget for those are being fought over. So this is really important. And the question around democracies, what is the fate for democracies having a role here? I think we've been talking about that a bit. One thing that I would just note again from some of the research is that it is tremendously alarming, the increase in the number of flawed democracies in the world, according to multiple measures. And I think that also puts a bit of weight behind the point, again, that Chada made, that this should not be about an alliance of democracies against the others, because there's questions about what defines democracy and the powers there. Member states will always act according to their interests. So on the point about engagement, I think there's sort of two. I took the point to be, don't trust dictators when you're negotiating around transitions or peace, or in the upcoming negotiations around Ukraine or such. But of course, we have to engage on two really important points. On problem solving that we've mentioned, we can't solve climate change without China. There has to be engagement there, and Russia as well. And there's a lot to be said on that. But one point that I would just make, since we are talking about threats to peace and democracy, we are entering into a profoundly dangerous period in world history. Looking at the sort of peace and conflict over the last post-Cold War period, we've been very focused on civil wars. But what Ukraine represents is the rise of the specter of interstate war again, which is dramatically more dangerous and costly in human lives. And the next 10 years of U.S.-China relations is fraught with danger. And that also requires engagement, real engagement, to think in terms of conflict prevention, managing the competition in a productive way as possible to ensure the maintenance of international peace can be endured.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your insights. And indeed, I think sometimes the best diplomacy is the diplomacy that you don't see. I think that is the most effective, and that is sometimes something that is lost a little bit in our modern ways of communication. And that's maybe a question to you, Noor, as well, you are the founder of the very important Al-Sharq TV channel, and information in general, well, it can easily be manipulated. So how is your experience experience and on this Egyptian example, how are you, what are the hurdles or what are the, let's say, the obstacles that are put in your way, and how do you see the competition with the, let's say, state-friendly media back home? Because this is, of course, an overarching problem. This is the problem as well in Russia. The Russian civil society is cut off from real objective information. Journalists are put that are critical are sent abroad. How is the situation in Egypt, and what are the ways to protect this free and fair information?
شكرا سعادة النائب مرة تانية على هذا السؤال. شكرا على هذا السؤال سعادة النائب، لكن اسمح لي قبل ما أجيب على هذا السؤال عايز يعني أشير لإجابة على سؤال الباحثة التي تحدثت عن فكرة التعارض بين المصالح والمبادئ. أنا في هذا المبنى في شهر مارس 2009 بعد خروجي من الاعتقال جئت إلى هذا البرلمان كي أشكر البرلمان على دوره، وقلت جملة ما زلت أسمعها حتى هذه اللحظة. قلت أن مصر حبلى في الشهور الأخيرة بتغيير قادم. فبعض أصدقائي من أعضاء البرلمان اعتبروا أن هناك قدر من المبالغة، رغم أن هذا حدث بعدها بشهور قليلة بقيام ثورة يناير. أنا بعد 13 سنة وأنا في نفس المبنى، ربما في قاعة مختلفة، لكن عندي نفس هذا الإحساس أن مصر حبلى بتغيير قادم. إحنا ما بنقولش لأوروبا ولا البرلمان خذوا معركتنا واصنعوا لنا التغيير، أبدا. كل ما نطلبه ألا تساعدوا الطرف الآخر علينا في منع التغيير، لا تصدقوا سردياتهم الكاذبة، تعاونوا معهم بحكم المصالح كما تريدوا، لكن لا تصدقوا أنهم ديمقراطيون أو إصلاحيون. حتى عندما يفتحون باب فهم يفتحون الأبواب بطريقة الأبواب الدوارة التي تدخل من هنا فتخرج إلى نفس النقطة. للأسف الشديد الإصلاح غير حقيقي. لا نريد أن تصدقوا هذه الإصلاحات، فقط اتركوا لنا معركة التغيير. وأنا مرة تانية من نفس المكان بقول أن مصر بل المنطقة العربية حبلى بتغيير قادم في المرحلة القريبة القادمة. أما السؤال عن الإعلام وعن الحقيقة إن الإعلام في مصر في حالة أسوأ بكثير جدا من أعتى الدول الاستبدادية والديكتاتورية. أنا شخصيا كان عندي قناة في مصر قبل أن تفتح، أغلقت سنة 2013، فخرجت إلى لبنان، ومن لبنان انتقلت إلى تركيا، حيث لم يكن لدي فرصة أن أجدد جواز سفري، وأنا يعني ظللت ممنوع من السفر حتى وقت قريب جدا، لأن جواز سفري السلطات لا تجدده. أنشأت هذه القناة في تركيا، هي الصوت الوحيد الذي يعبر عن الرأي الآخر في مصر. كل القنوات الفضائية في مصر التي ينفق عليها مئات المليارات من مصر ومن دول خليجية أيضا تنفق على هذه القنوات تتحدث بلغة واحدة. لا يوجد خبر واحد خارج السياق، كله في اتجاه واحد، وهو دعم الاستبداد في مصر وفي المنطقة. احنا كنا قناة تقريبا وحيدة. هناك ضغوط بتمارس حتى ضد تركيا البلد التي نقيم فيها، رغم أنها يعني لا تساعدنا ولا تقدم لنا أي مساعدات، لكن حتى ضغوط شديدة منذ عام لإغلاق هذه الأصوات. خرجنا بعض مذيعينا إلى الخارج، إلى أوروبا، كي يكون هناك في صوت آخر غير الصوت الموجود في تركيا. لكن احنا متأكدين أننا سنعود إلى بلادنا بأحزابنا، بقنواتنا، بكل طاقتنا المحبة للتغيير السلمي، المحبة للحرية والليبرالية والديمقراطية التي آمنا بها. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Noor. And I will give now the floor to Nadia, who is not in Kiev. Sorry for the mistake, but I think you are in a more secure place where you are. Don't hesitate, of course, to comment as well the interventions by the other panelists and the different questions that have been raised, because some were to you directly as well. And I had my question as well on the magnification impact of the crisis on certain developments and situations in the legal system, for example, that will be necessary for reform as well in your way joining the European Union. But Nadia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious of time as well, so I'll try to be brief in my response. Yeah, just found out that European Commission backed Ukraine's candidacy status within the EU, and the rule of law is going to be one of the areas that Ukraine would need to continue to work on even harder now with this new huge issue and huge problem, the element of dealing with all the grave crimes, the atrocity crimes that have been committed, and trying to deliver the best quality of justice to the victims of this armed conflict. So this is something that we have been working for a while now, and I agree 100% with what Shada said about working on on the resilience of the states individually, but also in this building the resilience of the of the entire world, essentially, collectively. And this is something that we realized since the start of the armed conflict in 2014, and we sort of realized that, with this additional sort of additional burden of investigating international crimes, which Ukraine had never, faced with before. Obviously, legal system was not did not have enough capacity to deal with it. Not in the institutional sense of things, not in the legislative sense. Resources were scarce as well at the time. And right now, I mean, as much as this war has brought a lot of damage, a lot of suffering and tragedy, it's also helped to magnify this issue now that, the entire world is paying attention to Ukraine's justice system, and they're trying to support it and back it and reinforce it. But unfortunately, there's this flip side of this coin, is that it's all being sort of, with all this intention and desire to help, there's little or no coordination going on. And the capacity of the domestic system, which is the most sort of responsible and the one that everybody's most relying on, does not have sort of the capacity still. It hadn't been built. The process hadn't been finalized before the February 2022 events. We had some very limited progress in some of the initiatives within the Office of the Prosecutor General, for instance. We had the War Crimes Department set up. We also had Crimean Prosecutor's Office, but essentially the rest of the system, it wasn't working. And the legislation has been a major stumbling block as well. So I mean, I could talk about it for hours, and I don't think it's I probably can discuss it in another forum, or we can, follow up if you're interested in this bilaterally. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of issues, a lot of questions, and unfortunately, the capacity is not there.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you as well for reminding us about the time, because we are already 5 minutes over our allocated time, and we could indeed have continued even further on in this fourth session of on threats to peace and democracy. I think we got a good insight from our experts and from our people that have been living on the ground as well, serious experiences of the threat to democracy, that have been imprisoned as well. I think we are really glad that you are, Noor, that you are today with us here alive. I think this is very important to underline. We from a European Parliament side, of course, are going to push very strongly way to get our influence being heard in the world, because I think it's all about as well spreading the word and not just closing the eyes because we don't feel directly concerned. I think it is very important that we continue as well as a parliament to play this very important role. I would like to thank everybody from you here joining us as an audience, but as well to thank all our panelists for the very good discussion we had, and I'm very much looking forward to continue as well the discussions at another future conference here, and eventually you could still join the panelists afterwards for some bilateral questions. I think they are not going to run away immediately. So thank you very much and have a lovely weekend.